We have Kristin and Subha here. They are going to lead us through tonight's session, and we're going to focus on the words and the spaces that we interact with and how our own implicit biases are a part of that as well. We are super excited to have them here tonight, and I'm going to give a quick shout out to our other brand partners for the summit. Tonal, Ufos, NYX, Les Mills, Boone, Undone, Avrani, Wander Beauty, Curious Elixirs, August, R&Co, Tone House, Asutra, Mad Tasty, Wordiful, Half Day, Athletic Brewing, and Olive and June. Well, a long list. And hopefully everyone had a chance to do their journal prompt. I can put the link in the chat to the instructions, just in case anyone missed it. And with that, I'm going to spotlight Subha so that when she's presenting, she's the main screen you guys are seeing. And if you have any questions throughout, feel free to use the chat to share those, and we'll make sure that they get asked. And I'm going to pass it over to Subha to introduce herself and kick things off.
Great. I am going to, hopefully all of you can see my PowerPoint here. So my name is Subha Lembach, and I specialize in doing a lot of training around equity and inclusion for a variety of different everything from volunteer organizations to professionally. I do it in juvenile justice, and that does include law enforcement agencies, so a very, very wide group. And so tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about inclusive culture and language to support equity. And so basically, I'm going to be reviewing just some basic language around terms you should be aware of, things to think about, and then to give you some really concrete tips about how you can use your language and develop culture, whether that's organizationally or even within yourself, around being more inclusive. And so what is inclusive language? Let me start there. Inclusive language, and I'm not going to read verbatim, just so you all know, because I know that can get very tedious. But basically, inclusive language is really, really important because it isn't just about avoiding slang and those obvious types of expressions that we know are kind of politically incorrect. You've probably seen that terminology in other spaces. But it's really taking it one step further and thinking about how the words I say and what I'm saying can really resonate with as many people as possible. And that plays out in so many different spaces in so many different ways. And that can be everything from, like, just to share some quick examples of language that's not inclusive that could easily be shifted is, I don't know about you, but in our household, yes, my husband's a doctor, but I also have a doctorate. And there's nothing that offends me more when I get mail that says Dr. and Mrs. Michael Lembach. It's like I don't have a personality, like I don't exist. And so something like that is not necessarily being inclusive. And think about how easy that would be to reframe. And how does that play out? I'll tell you, as someone who has worked as a professional and volunteer fundraiser, if you're not inclusive with your language, it can actually affect how much money you're raising. Another example, I often hear in different fitness spaces, you'll often hear like, oh, we've got to work on that summer body and things like that. And again, that's not very inclusive language, and there are easily ways to really support and build out your brand. And there are literally people I know who stopped going to certain instructors or certain coaches because their language is exclusive. And so inclusive language really is not just about those things you're aware of. Like, we all know, okay, you probably shouldn't say the N-word But it's really taking it a step further and thinking about how can I speak in a way that's going to be something that engenders positivity and support and really brings everyone together to understand who I am as an authentic individual. So one of the things that really plays out in terms of inclusive language are your implicit biases. And so what is an implicit bias? An implicit bias, I like to think of it as, there's a really great book by Daniel Kahneman around thinking fast and thinking slow. And so our brains are hardwired to think quickly. And that's a really critical skill. Why? Because if suddenly a cheetah were to enter my space and be 3 feet away from me, I need my brain to work really, really quickly, recognize that as a threat, and respond accordingly. And so our brains are inherently designed to really pick up on something and respond very quickly. And that's a great thing in those types of scenarios. Where it's less of a great thing, where it's less effective for us, especially in terms of thinking about inclusivity, is it is when it comes into play where I look at someone and I make assumptions about them, whatever that may be. And there's so many assumptions we're naturally going to make about people. And I hope one of the things you started to think about in terms of the journal activity are not just the implicit biases you have and that you bring to the table around other people, but the ones you have around yourself. Because we're all very quick. I mean, if you think about it, implicit bias is really about judgment. We're evaluating a situation and we're making a judgment very quickly. And we do that to ourselves on a regular basis as well. And we know everyone has these implicit biases. And so what do you do about them and how do you address them? And we're going to talk a little bit about that. So implicit biases are almost impossible to change. A lot of it is hardwired into how we think, and that's for many reasons. We are, as human beings, taught to think both culturally, along with kind of the way our brains work, to be able to distinguish, okay, that's different than what I am. And that could be looks, it could be a whole variety of diversity dimensions, and we're going to talk about that later. And so they are very, very hard to change. We are going to talk about some ways to change implicit bias, but first and foremost, it really comes down to breathing. It literally comes down to sometimes taking a step back and looking at a person or looking at a situation and not making those assumptions and really thinking about how can I take a step back? And even though my brain is telling me that when this person is behaving a certain way or when this person looks a certain way, what's the story there? And what's their story? And really looking at everyone at the end of the day as an individual. And so when we talk about kind of diversity dimensions and implicit bias, we often think, especially right now, given the cultural milieu, we often think about race. But it's also important for all of us to be aware that and this diagram doesn't even capture all of the diversity dimensions. There are so many different diversity dimensions. Diversity can play a role based on geographic location, military experience, work experience, first language, communication style. One of the examples I always like to get people thinking about is, take a minute to think about what your personality is like. Are you that type A personality? Are you that person who, when you get a project for work or for school, you get it done, there's no procrastination, you've got it organized, there's like a timeline, everything goes according to plan, and you've got to stick to the plan. And then how many of us who might have that kind of personality, which tends to be more like mine, might end up having to work with someone who waits till the last minute, doesn't really throws everything together the night before or the day of, basically gives, and when someone like that is on your team, I don't know about you guys, but it took me a lot of thinking about inclusion to become comfortable with that, to really think like, okay, I'm on a team with someone who is like a total procrastinator. I don't understand them. It doesn't make any sense to me. I don't even know how their brains work. But guess what? They're going to be able to get the same results or give me what I need for that team project. And so diversity dimensions even show up in terms of work style and how we work with each other. So diversity dimensions can even include things around, do you know some people who are like those night owls who stay up all night and have no problem doing that? And some people who are early risers. All of that plays into diversity and inclusion, because how often do you see, I mean, I know I see this in the media, like so-and-so wakes up, like Elon Musk wakes up at 4 a.m. and he's already, at work like half a day. And that's again, that's a place where we want to put value on that as a society, but that's just a different approach. And it's important to remember that diversity dimensions are very broad. And then there are also a number of diversity dimensions that we consider kind of primary diversity dimensions. And those are things you can't necessarily change easily. And those include things like age and race. And so there's a whole host of dimensions to think about, not just the traditional ones or the ones you may see, when you look at a person. And it's also important to remember when we think about inclusive language that everything you say is going to be filtered through someone's cultural perspective. So what does that mean? Have you ever accidentally, unintentionally offended someone by saying something that you thought they would take as a compliment, but they don't? A lot of that comes down to how you can interpret something. So I'm trying to think of a good example. And I can't really think of one now. But what is important to know is you could say, okay, I'll give you an example. So like my grandfather was very, very active in Rotary International. And in his culture, telling someone that their home is very homely, he completely means as a compliment, like, oh, wow, your home is so cozy and warm. However, when he would go to other people's houses in Western cultures and tell them their house was homely, homely means ugly in some cultures. And so something like that, it's important not to just think about what you're saying, but how the individual that you're saying it to is going to interpret it. Does that make sense? And again, that's something you see in a lot of environments too, where someone can actually unintentionally offend or unintentionally exclude someone by just not thinking about it. An easy one, and it's funny because when I was doing introductions, one of the things I wanted to say was, hey, happy National Wine Day. But I also need to recognize that there are a number of people I know personally who are struggling with sobriety. And so how can I reframe that? So I actually scheduled a virtual happy hour for my running group earlier. And I had to really think about not just calling it a virtual happy hour, but what else can I use in terms of language, and what description that can I use so that it's actually inclusive of who I want to have at the table and who I want to join in the virtual happy hour. And so it's important to remember that a lot of what you say, it's not just about what you're saying, it's about how it's being interpreted. And people bring a lot of baggage to the table. So let's spend a moment talking about equity versus equality. And I love this graphic because I think it pretty much sums up pretty well the definition. So in reality right now, and I'm not going to have a lot of time to talk about privilege, but you can see in reality, privilege plays out in that some people have a lot of boxes and they can easily see the baseball game. And that's the current reality of things in the world in many different circumstances. I mean, equality, and you often hear like, oh, we need women's equality, we need equality, we need racial equality. And that's how I used to kind of think about social justice, especially with respect to race. But if you look, equality doesn't necessarily actually level the playing field. Kind of where we're at and what we talk about in terms of the field of diversity and inclusion, especially racial equity and inclusion, is thinking about equity. Is how do we mitigate, how do we truly create an inclusive space? How do we create an inclusive playing field? And what that can mean is the boxes look like they're different for everybody. So an example I like to use with that is like, I have 2 siblings, and I don't know about you, I continue to insist that I am my parents' favorite child, but the relationship my parents have with each one of the 3 of us is very different. And how they've supported us in our journeys into adulthood is very different. Why? Because we're 3 very different kids with 3 very different needs. And so that's kind of a way to start to think about equity. And at the end of the day, when we're talking about true kind of inclusion, what we're really talking about is, as you can see, is that liberation picture. But I'm going to keep us moving. So how do you work in a space where you don't know how to necessarily be inclusive? Honestly, the answer is pretty simple. There's that first kind of tip of think slowly, take a step back and breathe. The other thing is just ask. And what that really means is it is far more inclusive to say, hey, I don't know. I don't know why you're in this fitness class. Are you in this fitness class to get a summer body? Are you here to strengthen? And really kind of just having conversation with people. And obviously I would never use the term summer body, but you get the idea. Like oftentimes it really comes down to just asking people. So one of the things like that happens to me all the time is people will, so first of all, just so you guys know, I'm from India and I'm Hindu by birth. And so I will have sometimes people come up to me and say, Salam alaikum, which is a Muslim greeting. And I get it. They're trying to be inclusive. They're trying to, respect my culture. But in reality, that could be really offensive. And so what the better approach sometimes is just to ask. And again, you don't just like start off a conversation like that. That's where the dialogue comes in and really kind of developing that relationship and being able to develop that comfortable space. On the flip side, I will also say it's just as important to create safe spaces for people to ask questions and for people to have dialogue back and forth so that you can work together in whatever community or group you're in terms of being more inclusive. So some impediments to communication, and this isn't just when we're talking about things like equity and inclusion and implicit bias. These types of things happen in all sorts of other types of relationships as well. Irrational assumptions. So again, going back to that type A personality, like I often assume if you're waiting till the last minute to get something done that I need you to get done, it's not going to get done, even though it usually, like my daughter's totally like that. And I oftentimes have to take a step back and say, it's going to be okay. And I literally have to tell myself, has she ever been late with an assignment? No. Okay, so then I'm the one with the issue, not her, if that makes any sense. And so really thinking through not making assumptions about people, people's styles, people's diversity dimensions. Misunderstanding, prejudice, and fear also really come into play. And that happens to us all the time. I mean, who hasn't had a conversation or communicated with someone and someone takes it the wrong way? And so again, that's where it's really important to build those relationships in those safe spaces. So ways you can really kind of be more inclusive, respect other people's opinions, acknowledge cultural, generational differences, and historical injustices without becoming defensive. And that doesn't mean you always have to agree, but it's about respecting different people's perspectives and understanding. And we talked about that earlier in terms of all the things people are bringing to the table, recognizing that and understanding that and we're going to do a little, I'll do a little image later, but what's in your suitcase, what I bring to the table every single day could be very different than what's in someone else's suitcase. And I'm not always going to know what they're dealing with. Be open to learning about cultures and ideas. And I will say that's way more than going to a Mexican restaurant or going to an Indian restaurant or whatever it is. When we're talking about being open to learning about other cultures and ideas, a lot of that is really trying to understand not just, again, ethnicity or race, but looking at diversity dimensions more broadly and really diving more deeply. Give others the benefit of the doubt in a dispute. And then seek first to understand others' points of view than to be understood. And honestly, if you think about so much of the divisiveness that we've had as a country over the past several years, a lot of the things here can also help, because a lot of this is about, if you really look at what the core values are here, it's about being open, being communicative, and being kind, and not making assumptions about people. So don't judge others by your own cultural standards. And I'll say that's something we do all the time. And that's something that also really varies community by community. And so, like, for example, where I live, it's really like I got a lot of flack when my daughter was younger because she hadn't had swimming lessons. Because where I live, culturally, that was very, very important. And so in another community, that might really not matter at all. And so it's really important to not bring your baggage to the table in terms of thinking about what someone else values or does not value. So what are inclusive behaviors and how do you approach inclusivity? Value, bridge, protect. Those are like the three kind of areas. So acknowledge someone for who they really are and make them feel appreciated for it. So if you think about it, we really used to think about, you've probably heard like, oh, the United States is a melting pot. And that was really during a time when we talked about things like being colorblind. And what we're really looking at and thinking about and what's important today is to be color brave. It's to recognize that we're all different and that there's value, true value in those differences. And how can you bring people together and kind of, I don't want to say override those differences, but being really color brave is about, and that's where it's really about embracing those differences and understanding that those differences can bring real value to the table, even if you don't understand those differences. And one of the things I often hear, particularly from people of color, is around making sure that we're not making assumptions about their experiences or speaking for them, and really thinking about privilege, which is a whole nother topic I love to talk about. Stepping in to support people when they're at risk of being excluded. So that's a really easy one. I'm sure you've been to different, it could be a happy hour, it could be a studio fitness class. There's so many spaces where, have you ever seen people who come in and they're the regulars and they're talking to each other and they're not necessarily including someone, and it's not necessarily intentional? So part of what we can do very easily to be more inclusive is just pull someone else into the conversation. Again, some of this is about just being kind. So when we're talking about inclusion, again, it's really about acknowledging and accepting differences, seeking to understand, and communicating policies and procedures in a way that is understood. And so that's more for like an organization. But part of what the challenge can be in many different settings is having people understand why things are the way they are. So why do you have to pay a fee to participate in a program? Sometimes just explaining to people, this is the reason for the fee, and this is why we need to create that kind of charge, can go a long way in helping people understand who might not otherwise really be able to relate to barriers for some, like charges for different things. So when we're talking again about organizations, and I wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about organizations, what we're looking for are equity of practices. So how is the organization providing fair and equitable treatment to all customers and stakeholders? So what does that look like in practice? And again, here we're not talking about one box for everybody. We're looking at different types of boxes. So for example, if you're a yoga studio, and equity of practice, how to be inclusive, might be having a wide variety of classes so that individuals who are new to yoga, individuals who might have injuries, individuals who might be coming in with knee replacements, etc., have an opportunity and a comfortable space to practice just as readily as people coming in for, their second hot power yoga class of the day. Organizational culture, extent to which culture avoids assimilationist strategies. So what does that mean? There's so many assumptions we make in terms of what is acceptable. And what I mean by that is, if you've ever been to an event and someone walks in and they're dressed totally differently than you. So like I remember going to a professional conference a couple of years ago, and the bulk of people were in business casual or above kind of dress. And a young woman walked in to like the reception, and she was literally wearing like cutoff shorts and a tank. And it can be, and to be frank, there really was no dress code per se. So it's not that her dress was unacceptable, but if you think about the judgment, the assumptions, all of the things that went through people's heads and came out of their mouths, how can we be better about creating a culture that includes everyone? Because there might be a real reason for that. And we see that play out in court a lot, where we have people who show up for court and they may not be wearing what you and I would see on like Law and Order in terms of people showing up for court, but that might be the best outfit they have. And so, for example, like when I first started practicing, one of the things I would always tell my clients, because I wanted them to show up in a suit if they had one, is I would say, show up in what you would wear to church on Sunday, show up in your Sunday best. And they would show up in like a pair of sweats. And it took me, that was a real educational opportunity for me, because it helped me understand that, oh, okay, that really may be the best that they have. And so what do I need to do in terms of thinking about inclusion? Voice and participation. So and I see that play out a lot. So oftentimes we think we're successful when we bring people with different diversity dimensions to the table. But in reality, how are we including their voices? How are they being engaged? And so, for example, some studies will tell you that, and I see this play out a lot on like nonprofit boards and even corporate boards, you'll have like one woman at the table, or like one person who's of a different kind of age dimension than everyone else. And in reality, that is not inclusion and that's not participation. Studies show that for effective voice from a diversity dimension you want to capture, so let's say you want to capture women's voices in a historically kind of male board, you need about a third. The magic kind of percentage, if you will, in a lot of social science research is you need about a third before there is that true authentic voice from women to participate in the conversation and to be contributing members. And so the other thing I want you all to think about too, and to be aware of, is this is something we all kind of don't get right 100% of the time. So it's really a spectrum. So there's cultural proficiency, which is what we want to aim for. But along the way, there's a whole spectrum of space that we are at. And again, this can vary with very different diversity dimensions. So for example, in terms of race, I might be very culturally competent and I might be very good about that. But when it comes to dealing with diversity dimensions around age, I may actually be either blind or I could even be destructive. And so it's really important to always understand that we're all learning and we're all growing. So becoming inclusive, I'm going to end with a couple of tips so I don't go over. Put people first. And so instead of calling someone a female salesperson, just say a woman on the sales team. So put people first, because at the end of the day, we are all so much more than the descriptions that we have kind of added to us. Use universal phrases. This one I have to give a Midwestern example. So when I'm from New York, I'm from the East Coast, and my husband was really one of the first like Midwestern people I'd ever met. And whenever he would talk, he would use all these phrases. And so I would think those were like Midwestern phrases. And so when I moved out to Columbus, I'd start tossing them around and everybody would look at me like I was totally insane and had no idea what I was talking about. And that's because apparently they were not Midwestern phrases. They were Michael Lembach phrases. And so it's really important just to think about the words you're using. Recognizing the impact of mental health language. You see a lot of this, especially right now with the pandemic, where people are unintentionally just, and frankly, it's not just mental health language, but it's any type of language that takes away from someone's experience. So for example, during the pandemic, with so much of us stuck at home, you know, you would see on social media all the time, like, I feel like I'm in jail or I'm in prison, and you're really not. And so just think about, again, the impact of the language you use through the lenses of those diversity dimensions. Use gender neutral language. So that's pretty simple. Don't use words like guys, and frankly, don't use words like girls. Don't use words like ladies. I hear all of those things in so many different like fitness classes or, you know, in different environments I'm in. And yes, it may be easier to just have that come out of your mouth because that's what you're used to hearing and that's what you're used to saying. But there are lots of other ways you can express that. Ask if you aren't sure. It is far less offensive to ask someone about their diversity dimensions than it is to say something and really have them feeling excluded. So, and this is going to segue into kind of our journal exercise. So with the journal exercise, a lot of what we wanted you to think about, both in terms of the space and how your space around you affects you, but also kind of what you think about yourself and kind of what's in your suitcase. So when I do this as a live training, I usually literally bring in a suitcase of stuff. And when I open up that suitcase, what I start to pull out, and it's funny because the first time I did it, I just put in different things I liked and was passionate about. And as I started to pull things out of my suitcase, I would pull out like a running medal because I love to run. I would pull out all these things. And it occurred to me at the end of that, at the end of me emptying out my suitcase, I didn't pull out anything that reflected my Indian heritage. Having said that, when people see me or when people talk to me, what do people usually start the conversation with? I often get like, where are you from? Oh, I love to eat Indian food. What's a really good Indian restaurant, you know, wherever I am. And so it's really important, and I hope you saw this with the journaling exercise as well, to think about how you think about yourself and how that plays out in terms of how you treat other people. And at the end of the day, the other point of it is also to really think about not just what's in your suitcase, but the fact that you don't know what is in someone else's suitcase. And without knowing what's in someone else's suitcase, it really just behooves you to be as inclusive as possible. And so what we wanted to do at this point was to kind of go into the breakout rooms and spend some time talking about and just reflecting on what you journaled on yesterday. What really struck out to you? What did you learn about yourself, both in terms of how you think about yourself and what you think about in terms of engaging with the world and engaging with other people? And then finally, and Kristin's going to talk about this next, how your space affected those perceptions. And so with that, just remember, you can become great by making people feel great.
So I wanted to do just a brief introduction of who I am and why I'm here. So my name is Kristin Cerutti. I am a licensed commercial interior designer, and I've been working in the field for 15 years. What the other two things mean is just that I've passed a series of tests and I'm accredited to design sustainable spaces and spaces that are designed to improve the lives of the people who inhabit the spaces. So that's part of why I'm here. I truly care about how space can affect the people that occupy it. I also have a cousin who's on the spectrum. A lot of my very close friends have family on the spectrum, and I've actually had the privilege to work with someone on the spectrum in a past job as well. And I think, we've been talking a lot, and Subha did a great job of introducing this. We need to look beyond people's physical differences and really focus on true inclusion. So why talk about this now? I think the importance of mental health and empathy has really come to the forefront over the last year. It's one of the positives I think we've gotten out of all of this. Human well-being matters. And I think companies are finally starting to realize that if they truly get to know their employees, who they are, what matters to them, that they will be more productive and efficient, which is what companies want in the end. This great new renewed focus of diversity, equity, inclusion, and then this idea that work can happen anywhere means that we need to pay attention to physical space everywhere. So I'm going to share a ton of statistics with you on this call today. And I want to make sure everyone understands I am not a doctor, and I am definitely not an expert in neuroscience. So the data that I'm going to share with you is available through places like the CDC, World Health Organization, and other organizations that support people with the conditions we're going to discuss. And I've cited all my sources. So if you do like to dig deeper and learn a little more, you can definitely do that, or always reach out to me for more info too. So I want to start and have everybody just take 1 minute. If you can, close your eyes. And I want you to imagine a day when you were at your absolute worst. This could be your kids kept you up all night and you didn't have your coffee in the morning. Maybe you were hungover from a really great party the night before, but you still had to go to work or school or do your daily tasks. Or maybe you were just emotionally exhausted. So think about what your worst day would be for you. How did the space you were in affect how you felt on that day? Did it affect your productivity? Overall, how did the physical space help or hinder how you were feeling? Now I want you to hold that with you as we go through the presentation, that feeling. I'm going to ask you to recall it a couple times because I think it'll help you understand a little bit better what we're going to talk about. And we're going to focus on neurodiversity. I want to give you a little bit of background on what it is and who's included in that group. So if we take the word and just simply break it down, neuro relating to the nervous system or the brain, and diverse showing a great deal of variety. So big picture, all I'm trying to say is that no two brains are the same. But some do behave in similar enough ways in order to be categorized. So the categories we're going to talk about tonight are neurotypical, which is just as it sounds, brains that function in a way that is considered typical, and then neurodivergent. So neurodivergent is a wide range of brains that just don't fall into the category of neurotypical. There are 6 main categories that fall into neurodivergence. And we're going to break those down and talk a little bit about what each of those 6 are. And as I explain each of the 6, I really want you to focus on how you think someone that falls within that category experiences space differently than those of us who are neurotypical. So the first in the group is ADHD. And we might think we're really familiar with this, and some of us may know people who are on this portion of the spectrum. It stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. But we may not realize that 2.5% of adults in the world have been diagnosed with it. It's actually one of the more common neurodevelopmental disorders that is discovered in childhood, but it often lasts into adulthood. It causes abnormal levels of hyperactiveness and also impulsive behaviors. So I'm going to show you common challenges and strengths for each, but I really want you to focus on the strengths. Knowing the challenges that people within these groups deal with daily is very important, but I think we don't often enough focus on what these people can bring to the table that would be missing if they weren't there. So you'll also notice as we go through this, a lot of the strengths you'll see are kind of the polar opposites of what you see in challenges. And this is often because people with these disorders have been, unfortunately, they feel like they have to hide them and pack them down. So they've been spending their entire lives trying to hide the fact that they have some of these conditions. And in order to do that, they are extremely good at other things that some of us that are neurotypical are not. The best example I can give you is my cousin, who is on the autism spectrum, and he is not as good in social interaction situations, but he is a math whiz and can multiply, add, divide you could give him 25 numbers in a series of a math equation, and he could answer it for you in about 30 seconds. So things that they aren't super comfortable with, they often tend to be fabulous at things that you would say are the exact opposite. So speaking of my cousin, we're going to talk about the autism spectrum disorder next. 1 in 54 children in the world are diagnosed with a form of autism. And there are so many subtypes of autism. I think a lot of us are familiar. We've heard the term Asperger's. Most of the subtypes are influenced by both a combination of genetics and environmental factors. And like I was saying about my cousin, some of the things that people with autism are just truly amazing at are solving problems. They're really amazing at thinking about things differently, super detail and attention focused. So for example, my cousin is fabulous with math. So he found a great job at an accounting firm because it's something he truly loves, and he excels and is so much quicker at turning around some of those solutions than some of his neurotypical counterparts. Dyslexia is one that we probably also hear fairly frequently. It's a disorder that involves difficulty with reading, identifying speech sounds, and learning how they relate to letters and words. And 1 in 10 people in the world have been diagnosed with dyslexia. Common strengths, again, because some of the things they struggle with are reading and writing, they tend to be fabulous when it comes to things like spatial awareness, design, being able to think outside of the box. So having people with dyslexia at the table and not just having instructions, for example, that are laying on the table that are only in written form, being able to create instructions and directions that have icons rather than words can be super helpful and more inclusive. Dyspraxia might be one that you're not familiar with or haven't heard before. This is a brain-based motor disorder, and it affects fine and gross motor skills and coordination. So a lot of people that have dyspraxia are actually just labeled as clumsy. They don't actually get diagnosed, which is why you're seeing such a large swing there in the percentage of children worldwide that have been diagnosed. I also just want to point out that although this is a brain-based motor disorder, it has absolutely nothing to do with one's intelligence. So people who deal with dyspraxia, as you can imagine, having issues with coordination is a little bit more of a visible difference in abilities than some of the others we previously discussed. So having to deal with that their entire lives, they tend to be extremely empathetic individuals. They can easily understand what other people are dealing with because of what they have had to overcome in their lives. Dyscalculia is also probably one you have not heard before. This, more easily described, is number dyslexia. So it's a math learning disability that makes it hard for someone to understand number-related concepts and problem solving related to numbers. And this one, I think, was probably one of the most shocking for me when I started doing this research, that 6% of the world population has this. I didn't even know this existed, to be completely honest, before I started researching all of this about a year ago. So again, because they tend to struggle a little bit when it comes to number concepts, they are fabulous when it comes to words, strategic thinking, and problem solving that way. And the last of the 6 that we're going to focus on is Tourette's syndrome, which is a disorder that involves repetitive movements or unwanted sounds that people can't control. And 1% of the world's population has been diagnosed with Tourette's. And again, similar to when we were talking about dyscalculia, this is one that's a little bit more visible and harder to hide. So they are extremely empathetic as well, and they are fabulous verbal communicators. I now want to share a couple important statistics that may also be shocking with you. The first being that after we kind of went through all those, 15 to 20% of people worldwide are on the neurodivergent spectrum. So I'm just going to leave that there for a second so we can all kind of digest. 20% of the world's population is neurodivergent. And at least 1 in 8 people in your workforce are. Think back when I first asked you about how you felt on your worst day. How did that physical environment affect you? Were the lights just too bright and it was causing you to be distracted? Were noises causing you to be really uncomfortable? What was it about that environment that bothered you? Now, think about 20% of the world's population feels that way almost every single day. And yet we still rarely design spaces with those people in mind. We as an industry, a design industry, have been required to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act, which supports those who have varying physical abilities, legally since the 90s, which is actually when the term neurodivergence became popular, was in 1990, so the same year. But despite the fact that such a large number of people are on the neurodiversity spectrum, we still often just expect those people to adapt to the spaces rather than design spaces for them. An even scarier number to me is that approximately 50% of people who are on the spectrum have no idea that they are. Why is this? It's because so many people are either never diagnosed or misdiagnosed. A lot of these conditions present themselves in similar ways to what would potentially be labeled a behavioral issue, clumsy, an introvert, and a lot of them also have similar symptoms to other disorders. So it's not uncommon for someone who's on the autism spectrum to also potentially be dyslexic or have dyspraxia. So very often someone may get diagnosed for one of these, but the doctors may potentially miss the fact that they also have 1 or 2 others as well. In addition, a lot of these tests, and very specifically the autism spectrum disorder tests, were designed to test for the disorder in men only. These tests often don't even show conditions in women. And women show, or the conditions present themselves very differently in men than they do in women. So a lot of women on the spectrum aren't diagnosed at all, or they're diagnosed in their late 20s, late 30s. So there are many women out there who are on the spectrum and could be working in our offices and just not even know that yet. So I want you to just take a brief moment and think about how many people on a typical day when we're all, at work and going about our daily lives that you encounter, whether it's friends, family, how many, even strangers, how many people you encounter that are on the spectrum that you never even knew, or they might not know themselves. So I know, at least for myself, after seeing the statistics, I feel like it's a little taxing and a little overwhelming. And how do we even begin to start tackling how to make things better? So I want to take some time to kind of talk about how each of us can do one small thing maybe to help improve the lives of those who are living on the spectrum. So if you only take one thing away from this discussion today, I want it to be this: just, we need to get past one size fits all. For years, that was a saying, and we need to just move on, because I think we all agree that that just doesn't work. We design spaces, products, policies with the idea that we're doing the best thing if we design for the majority. But when we do this, you're always going to leave somebody out. And most of the time you leave a lot of somebody's out. We're just, unfortunately, a society that believes if someone needs something, they're going to ask for it. And until they do, then we can just move on with our lives and wait till they come and ask for assistance. But I want us to try to take a step back and not necessarily always put the onus back on those who are already dealing with adversity, and instead try to reach out ahead of time so they don't necessarily feel like they have to put themselves out there. The other thing I want to point out is that when we ask people who have been compacting their disorders or trying to hide them for so long to have to come to us to ask for something in order to just be able to do their jobs, or just to be able to get by a little bit easier in their daily lives, we're forcing them to draw further attention to themselves, which often makes them super uncomfortable and makes them feel even worse than they were feeling before. So that's why I want to talk a little bit now about how we can start designing spaces for those who need us the most. I want to take just another minute to talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act, because I think it's something we all interact with every day. So I'm a neurotypical person, and I'm also physically abled. And I personally can tell you I've never been hindered by a height adjustable table or a braille sign or a ramp or a lever door handle. And I know there have been so many times in my life where I've been carrying way too much stuff, or I'm carrying a cat that's squirming and I just need to get a door open. And I know how helpful it's been to just hit my elbow on that button on the door and the door magically opens. Or I'm carrying too many things and there's that hold open button on the elevator. But have you, I know I often don't, think twice about why those things are actually there. They were designed for people who need us the most, and yet it helps all of us. We're all completely unique, and we're all miraculous individuals, and we deserve to inhabit places that play to our strengths. So designing for those who need us the most is always going to help everyone in the process. It's not going to ever do the opposite. So I now want to take a minute and talk about a few examples of how we could do this. So with all the conditions I spoke about earlier, there are both people who fall on the hypersensitive side of those conditions and those who fall on hyposensitive side of those conditions. So I'm going to break it down with hypersensitive first and talk a little bit about how people that are hypersensitive affect space, and then we'll talk about hyposensitive. So for those who are hypersensitive, they're overstimulated and they need their space to reduce the stimulation of their senses. So making sure that they have options and places they can go to be alone, whether that space is open or enclosed, because they often tend to be overstimulated from all the senses. So not just noise, not just visual, also scent, the sense of smell. So if you imagine, I know in our office, people will burn toast or popcorn, and we all just laugh and kind of move on in the afternoon. But for someone on the spectrum, that can distract them for the rest of the day, and they won't be able to get anything done. So being able to have places where people can go when they are feeling overstimulated, to be able to be alone and by themselves. Also, people who are hypersensitive tend to have difficulty manipulating small objects. So think about, all the conference rooms where you walk into and there are these little remote controls, maybe like even 4, 5, or 6 of them just laying on the counter, waiting for you to figure out what buttons to push, and how intimidating that might be, not just for the fact that most of us can't figure out which one to use, but the fact that they're having trouble manipulating it. So in situations like that, having maybe a touch screen that has larger font. And again, if we think about, we talked about some people who have struggles with numbers as well as some who struggle with letters. The most inclusive you can do for something like that is having a large icon. So then you're not relying on having to be able to read the word that's on the screen or pick numbers, 1, 2, or 3. You can pick the icon that's representing what you want to do. Consider visual barriers. So maybe even if you're, maybe even if you're in an open office environment, some people who are on the spectrum and are hypersensitive have a really hard time making eye contact. So if you do have some areas where there are workstations with higher panels, where when you're seated, you don't have to stare at the person across from you, that can also be extremely beneficial. Dimmer switches, dual switching, being able to adjust the light in the room. People who are hypersensitive often have a lot of trouble in very brightly lit areas. So although we do need to meet certain lighting requirements for code, it's so easy to just add something like a dimmer switch so that the people using the space have a choice and can use it whichever way they feel most comfortable. I know another thing that's been insanely popular over the last 10 years is glass everywhere. Everything's full height glass and everybody can see everybody and what everybody's doing. And there are so many benefits to that. We all know what natural light does to us, both emotionally and spiritually. But there are some people who that is so distracting for them. So the image you're seeing on the left here is a large conference center in an office space. But if you consider maybe just having the main hallway to access those conference rooms being on a back corridor versus a main corridor, there will be less people walking down the corridor and being visual distractions. And you can also add, which there are in this image, but you can't see, there's drapery that comes down from the ceiling. So if the person is still just too distracted or needs to block out the light, they can also hit a switch and the drapery will come down to block the glass as well. The other thing I do just want to mention is people who are hypersensitive sometimes have issues with balance. So it's important that seating options are stable. So providing a variety of different types of seating options, but you see the one that's in the image on the right, it's not something that's on really tiny little legs that if you just sit in it in the wrong way, it's going to tip over. Making sure that there is some furniture like that throughout the space for people who do feel balance issues to be able to sit down. So next is hyposensitive. And it's truly just the reverse of what we just talked about. So those who are hyposensitive actually need their space to stimulate their senses. So providing a variety of places where they can go and you can hear that background noise or the buzz of an office. You've got the chit chat going on behind you while you're on a conference call. For some people, they need that and that energizes them. Consider having a variety of physical textures. People who are hyposensitive, you will often see that they have some sort of an item in their hand that they're often constantly rubbing, or they're touching their leg or the seat of the chair that they're sitting in, because they do get a lot of, they take a lot in through tactile experiences. So if you can have a variety of different textures and colors to fabrics and furniture, that can also help those who are hyposensitive. Hyposensitive people do enjoy spaces that are clear glass, because even when they are working alone, they can still feel as if they're engaged in the activity in the space. And for hyposensitive people, they often move a lot. So having furniture on swivels or casters so they have the ability to move and not feel limited is important. Maybe having some rooms with smaller furniture that's easy to move around. So depending on how they want to use a space, they can move it around themselves. And then bright, bold colors and patterns really energize people who are hyposensitive. So having some spaces where you can go when you need that extra energy in the morning, because maybe you didn't have your cup of coffee, or someone who's on the spectrum and just needs a little bit to get them going, color and pattern is also super helpful. So we don't all have these huge offices that have, hundreds of different rooms that can be designed in all different ways. So how would you address something like this if it's just one public area or a smaller space? Basically, it comes down to just give people choices and options. You want to be able to accommodate both those who are hypersensitive and hyposensitive. So providing options where they can choose where to go based on where they feel most comfortable and safe is the best possible thing you can do. So if you see in both of these images here, this is a wide open space, but intentionally this one was built out so it has 3 completely solid sides. So someone sitting there can kind of see what's going on around them, but they don't have to worry about visual distractions from the side. No one's going to walk up behind them unexpectedly. And yet you can also choose to sit out here more in the open where people are walking right by you. You can kind of look and peek over the top. In this one, similarly, you can sit completely open and see people from all directions. You can sit in the open area, but have it kind of tucked away behind another design element and blocking your peripheral. And conference rooms and rooms where you can choose whether they're open or closed. So if someone's in there and they do want to be alone, but feel like they can hear what's going on around them, or if they do just need to get away completely, they have the ability to close it off as well. Here are just a few more, but basically what it comes down to, the easiest way to think about it is opposites. So if you're going to provide something that's really wide open, you also need to have something that's closed nearby. If you're going to have a bunch of workstations with low panels, you need to have a similar amount of workstations with high panels. If an area is bright, you should also have some areas that are dim. Fixed furniture, mobile furniture, giving people options to choose what's going to work best for them is going to make the space the most welcoming for people with a variety of needs. So for the last time, I just want you to think back again to how you felt on that worst day. And are you able now, hopefully, to think of one thing that you could have changed about that space that would have made it more inclusive for you and for others? Maybe it is just being able to have the ability to dim the lights. Maybe it would have been being able to have a chair with a really high back in the corner that you could have kind of tucked away to be by yourself. I know for me, I absolutely love reading more on these types of topics, but again, I know we all learn differently. So I've included a variety of different ways you can continue to read or understand more about this topic, from podcasts to Instagram accounts. And every Instagram account that's there is someone who is on the spectrum. There are also wonderful people on the spectrum who are writing books. They are consulting companies. And then the two I want to point out all the way at the bottom on the left-hand corner, if you own a company or if you work for a company who you think might be interested in looking into how to be more inclusive for those on the spectrum, these are 2 good places to start. The Creative Differences Handbook was created to help not only create policy, but to help you understand how you can physically change your office to be more inclusive. And I will tell you, as you start looking into this, you will find the majority of the really good information out there is actually from the UK. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of research happening in the US on this topic. So the Do It Profiler is a company out of the UK that will work with you and your company to help you better understand how inclusive you are today and how you could be better in the future. So I just want to say thank you. I'm completely honored to be here and be a part of this week, especially partnered with Subha. I just think it was like the perfect intro to this. the fact that you chose to take your time tonight to better educate yourselves in order to make the lives of others better, I think just says so much about who you are as people. And I want to continue to be a resource for you. So I've included both my personal and my professional Instagram accounts, as well as my work email and phone number. And I truly want you to feel like you can use it. So anytime, even if it's a year from now, something comes up, please feel like you can reach out, because I would be more than happy to help connect you with anyone that could help. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.